The wilderness of Judah is located in the dry area east of the Judean hills. And it's been created, or it's caused by the rain shadow effect, where we've already looked at this, but the clouds come from the prevailing winds, which come from the west. Those clouds get their moisture over the Mediterranean Sea. They drop it in the hill country of Judah, and then there's no more clouds to drop any rain to the east, so we have a rain shadow effect in the Judean wilderness. So rarely rains in the Judean wilderness. Luke 12:54 says, "And he was also saying to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, a shower is coming, and so it turns out." So we see that they were aware of the prevailing weather patterns, that these clouds came in from the west and brought rain. Now, those clouds would drop their moisture on the hill country, in particular Jerusalem, and as you travel east, we're looking due east in this picture from Jerusalem, we see just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, it becomes very dry, very barren, and so this is the area of the Judean wilderness and extends down to the Jordan Valley. So that area is very dry, just to the east of the Mount of Olives. This is what the Judean wilderness looks like. Very inhospitable place, very dry, very barren. Again, you can see it here. But this was the area where Jesus was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by Satan. Isaiah says, in talking about the coming of Messiah in the future, "A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Let every valley be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And let the rough ground become a plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley." And in the wilderness, Judean wilderness, it's rough terrain. A lot of deep gorges that have been carved by wadis. And so the picture that Isaiah is presenting here is these areas need to be flattened out so that we can have a smooth highway so that Messiah could come. Matthew 4:1-3 talks about the temptation of Jesus in the Judean wilderness. "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread.'" And as we look at the barren terrain of the Judean wilderness, nothing but rocks out there, you can see nothing else to turn into bread. Very little grows there. So it's a very barren, lonely place. Well, let's talk about the Negev. It literally means south in Hebrew. It's a dry area going farther south. It's almost devoid of agriculture. In this picture, satellite picture, looking northeast, we can see the Dead Sea there. That may help you get oriented. And in this picture, there are 3 giant craters, almost look like moon craters, in the Negev. And these giant craters make travel in the Negev difficult. You kind of have to go around. Sometimes they would go through, but it would make travel difficult. Here you can see the rim of this crater on the left-hand side where the road is, and then it descends down into this huge crater that if you look way off in the distance, you can see the rim on the far side. Well, the Negev is a dry area where rainfall decreases as one travels south, so as we keep going south, things become drier and drier. Luke 12:55 says, and when you see a south wind blowing, you say, it will be a hot day. And so it turns out that way. So when you describe wind, you talk about the location from where it came. So a south wind is blowing from the south. And so that would be from the Negev, thus a hot, dry wind. The southern Negev is very dry and desolate. So it just keeps drying out as one travels south. And thus, this caused problems for Hagar when she was driven out by Sarah, that in this wilderness, unless you have access to wells, you're going to die of thirst. And so really the sending of Hagar away was a death sentence, unless God intervened on her behalf. So let's look at Genesis 21:14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. This is in the Negev. When the water in the skin was used up, she left the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. For she said, do not let me see the boy die. And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Yes, this is the conditions of the Negev. And sometimes, well, in the case of Hagar, God did intervene and saved her and Ishmael. In the days of Abraham, sometimes they would fight over water rights at wells. And this is a well that exists to this day at a place called Beersheba. This is an area where Abraham would have lived. Genesis 26:18 through 19 says, Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there was a well of flowing water. So, yes, they fought over water rights there in the Negev because water is scarce. In Genesis 26, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, The water is ours. So they named the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too. So he named it Sitnah. So we can see, this is a matter of life and death. Water rights, access to water. Israel has tried this agricultural project in the Negev to see, can they use natural techniques, much like in biblical times, to live in the Negev. And this is an experimental agricultural farm, and they haven't quite figured it out how the patriarchs were able to survive in the Negev. You can see it's a tough place to grow things. Here in this satellite image, you can see, as we look to the east, left would be north, you can see all the fertile cultivated fields in the foreground. But then you get to a certain point, almost like a line in the sand, where to the south, to the right, nothing else grows. And so this is even with modern irrigation. So you can see there comes a point where in the Negev, just things don't grow anymore. And that's illustrated by this satellite image. Well, the Negev served as a protective front for Israel and its history from Egypt. And so it kind of kept the Egyptians apart from Israel. served as a natural protective front. The Negev also provides access to the Red Sea and the Transjordan. So as you move from the Negev, you can head south down the Jordan Valley to the Red Sea, or you can move over to the King's Highway and either go north or south from there. Well, let's see how wadis, they're so important in the land of Israel, and we need to understand them a little better. How they come into play in some of the metaphors, some of the figures of speech in the scripture. Psalm 126:4 says, "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev." So what does that mean, these streams in the Negev? How is that like having one's fortunes restored? Well, we know that these wadis, these streams in the Negev, when it rains in the higher elevation areas, the water rushes down and fills these wadis. And so it comes very quickly, almost without warning. And so that's what the psalmist is praying for. Lord, restore our fortunes quickly. Just like the water in these wadis come on quickly. Sometimes they run to get their bucket, and by the time they come back, the water's already gone. But they're asking for the Lord to restore their fortunes quickly. Another verse out of Job talks about how wadis can be deceitful. My brothers have acted deceitfully like a wadi, like the torrents of wadis which vanish. And so, the water rushes into these wadis, fills up these dry riverbeds, they become a torrent, and then before too long, the water's gone. And so they can be deceitful. You think you're going to have a water source, you go get your bucket, and by the time you get there, the water's gone. Here's a dry wadi near Jericho, New Testament Jericho, and you can see filled with sand and rocks. But when it rains up in the hill country and the water drains down, that dry riverbed, that wadi, becomes a raging torrent. And so this is a wadi with water in it. And so you can see how they are transformed when it rains up in the hill country. And so the water gushes down through these wadis. Remember, like Jerusalem is on the watershed. The water either flows down to the west or to the east, and so that water just rushes down. In this slide, we can see waterfalls in these wadis where it has rained in the hill country, and now in the Negev and other places, the wadis just become filled with water, raging torrents of water. That concludes our lesson for today. Next time, we'll be looking at the Rift Valley and the Transjordan.